Hi, friends. Building on the idea of creation as the dwelling place of God from last week, this week in chapter 6, Johnson raises the question, what is God doing here? And with a flourish of questions, she asks, how are we to understand not just the presence, but the activity of the giver of life? How does the vivifier relate creatively to the processes of evolution, which, in scientific terms, proceeds according to its own principles? What can the beast possibly mean when they say the hand of the Lord has done this, given their own unpredictable emergence in the course of evolution? How, in a word, can the evolving world be understood as God's good creation, with the emphasis there on good? Johnson begins to answer with this topic of unpredictability or chance, because mutations and the environmental pressures that select for them are random. And the old theories of deism, as we discovered with William Paley, do not allow for chance or contingency, nor does the idea of monarchical theism, in which God directs and micromanages all of the change that happens. This is kind of a fatalist perspective. But her proposal that God's creative activity brings into being a universe endowed with innate capacity to evolve by the operation of its own natural powers, making it a free partner in its own creation. That's a freighted statement, but it allows for contingency and chance because that's all part of free will and love. God's Spirit accompanies and enlivens creation and equips creation to evolve and adapt by its own powers. This is working with creation's freedom to organize and emerge in ever diverse new forms. The Spirit, in this case, is the dynamic ground of creation's becoming. And recognize they are not being, but becoming. And with that, she invites us into this philosophical conversation about the relationship between being and act. That is that the creator or the cause and the acts which follow, the causes are related in these great causal chains, which everyone from Plato and Aristotle up to today have continued to parse and think about. But theologically, in the Christian framework, act and being are understood as one movement. And the reason is God is love, and love is an act. Love is active. If something is love, it must love. And this calls Johnson to think about Catholic theologian Karl Rahner's statement that creation is not a treatise on God as cause or the being of God, but rather a treatise on grace. That is, everything that we see, creation, is a result of the act of love. Karl Rahner suggests that the divine act and our human flourishing, and by extension, the flourishing of all creatures, are directly proportional. His point here is that love and the goodness of Creator are seen in the way that creatures grow and beget new life and evolve. Irenaeus actually believes something similar when he conceived the God-human relationship with the phrase Gloria Dei vivens homo, which Johnson translates, the glory of God is the human being fully alive. Bernard of Clairvaux, she remembers, felt the same, that what began by grace, by an act of love, is completed by grace and free choice together. So Johnson asks, could it not be the case that rather than being uncharacteristic of God's ways, compassionate self-giving love for the liberation of others is what is most typical of God's ways, and therefore also distinguishes divine working in the natural world? She asks, could it not be that since the Spirit's approach to human beings powerfully invites, but never coerces a human response, then the best way to understand God's action in the evolution of the natural world is by analogy with how divine initiative relates to human freedom? Well, of course, she answers her own question positively, but so did Luther. On Freedom of a Christian, we hear from Luther, that our becoming, our fulfillment is our freedom and our liberty is actually found when we are bound, when we embrace our roles as creatures who need to be in loving service in relationship to our neighbor. In other words, we find our glory, our fulfillment, when we realize our full identity as being creatures. Johnson recognizes that this perspective commits us to a certain understanding of omnipotence that's not shared in all corners of Christianity. It's certainly not part of the monarchical theist terms that were described above, but rather, as Pannenberg puts it, the omnipotence of God can be thought of not as the assertion of a particular authority against all opposition, but rather omnipotence is only the power of divine love. In the end, she roots this position in that concept of God as love, or the Spirit as lover, a mature love that wants nothing more than the object, the other, to thrive and become what it truly is. For Johnson, this love in action links ultimate and proximate causes, that is, God's ultimate desire for creation to be and to live, and the ways in which creation goes about living. Ultimately, Johnson acknowledges that seeing creation as a plenitude of God's love, the overflowing result of God's love and wisdom, is a mystery, but it's one that we can understand how it works. It's a mystery with proximate causes that we can understand. And she cites various theories in this chapter as to how we can interpret all of this. She names logos, causal hinge theory, body, kenotic, process theology, and the others that you can read here in this chapter. And we can discuss the relative merits and weaknesses of each. But the overall point remains that God is acting in history and in nature in a way that can be understood. And why not? Proximate knowledge, while distinct from ultimate knowledge, doesn't distract us or contradict that ultimate presence or purpose, and the fact that God works within those secondary proximate causes. So in the end, what we're really talking about is participation. Johnson writes, the power of creaturely agents to cause change in the world is a created participation in that uncreated power of the one who is pure act. Remember, that is to say, love, our participation in love. Conversely, she goes on, the Creator's Spirit's generous goodness and wisdom are seen especially in the creation of a world with its own innate agency. The innate agency of creation reveals the goodness from which it was created. Now recognize that this is not God in the gaps, where God is just suggested as the cause for something that's missing, which normally means we don't yet understand it. Rather, divine love as a pure act is concursus in the Latin word that she uses. It's happening at the same time. The relationship that begets and nurtures life is a part of the creative, life-giving, and sustaining image and likeness of God that we bear. So she says, divine being, which creates because it's love, the divine agency, which empowers that creation to act, and divine goodness, which is God's will to draw us in and reconcile us towards that goal, all work together. And we as creatures, separate from God, participate in it through that God-given agency. Love, divine love, wants its object to be fully ourselves, the creatures we were created to be, with our real agency to live and act. Love gives us that freedom. And this view holds that the greatness of the Creator and the integrity of creatures can be held together. So we should ask about the explanatory power of this explanation. And Johnson admits that lots of folks criticize this position, which is basically Neo-Thomism, or Thomas Aquinas applied to evolution. But basically it means that all goodness participates in some way in divine goodness. God's work, as she writes, is achieved in and through creaturely cause and effect. It's not in competition with it. So we don't have to parse the being and the act or the great chains of causality. She posits they're simply not in competition. They work together for life to flourish. She concludes by showing that unlike deism or monarchical theism, this view does have the explanatory power to embrace the way that law and chance work together. Or in other words, natural selection and random mutation work together to adapt life and sustain it in ever increasingly elegant, diverse, and beautiful ways. She writes, there's a deep compatibility between the creative, though not conscious, ways physical, chemical, and biological systems operate through that interplay of law and chance on the one hand, and a person's experience of consciousness and freedom within their physical embodiment on the other. She quotes Stoger, who writes, God is always acting through the deterministic and indeterministic interrelationships and regularities of physical reality, which our models and laws imperfectly describe. In this way, Johnson gives us a framework for thinking about the pneumatological aspect of creatio continua. God's spirit as love means that the creature is created with its own generative powers. Now, personally, this recalls me, as it did for Augustine, to that verse in Genesis, those verses that describe the inherent agency of the earth itself. Genesis says, the earth and the waters brought forth life. And this is what we can expect from a God who is love and truly loves us. Johnson remembers Ralston's observation that the laws of physics and chemistry are reliable, but nothing in them demands that the earth be created, let alone elephants. In other words, God wanted it to be. Life is an open adventure that involves, as does Rahner's theological anthropology, spirit and matter, where new life always emerges, that is its transcending or becoming its full self, and participating in the goodness of life all along the way. As a father, I know that that's what I want for my children. And Johnson affirms that in Darwin's evolving entangled bank, we can see that the Creator desires the same for all creatures. And that is why ultimately our confession of God as Creator and we as creatures is truly good news.